Hey there, folks. Today we're going to cover another case that is often recommended to me. Many of you are probably familiar with it in some way, and that is the case of Stacy Arras, who disappeared in Yosemite National Park back in 1981. And while the case is well known among people with an interest in missing persons cases, there are relatively few details out there about the incident and the investigation that took place thereafter. So first, I'll lay the groundwork of the case and explain everything that I could dig up about what happened before, during, and after the disappearance. But perhaps most importantly, I'm going to show you what this location looks like in Yosemite. It's a relatively high elevation area known as the Sunrise Lakes. And from there, we'll see if we can come to any reasonable theories about what happened to Stacy Arras. While this case is a bit of a head-scratcher, once we get to the end, I think you will probably agree that there are some explanations for this case. I mainly say that because for a long time this incident has been one that people have deemed unexplainable, or paranormal, or whatever. It's a keystone case in the Missing 411 archive, so that should tell you something. Anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's get into the events that took place on July 17th, 1981. But real quick, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Raycon. Raycon earbuds really do make your everyday life easier, and for someone like me who likes listening to music or podcasts while I'm out hiking on a trail or simply just walking around, I find that these earbuds are genuinely superior to other brands out there. For one, they stay in your ear very well, unlike other brands I've tried. This is especially important if you're going to be moving around a lot like me. But in addition to that, they're comfortable. And they're weatherproof, sweat resistant, so basically they're perfect for active users, which means they'll work just as good even if you're not being active. With a 32-hour battery life, I don't have to always worry about putting them in the charger, but even if I do, it's not a problem at all because 10 minutes of charging time yields 90 minutes of battery life. That's hard to beat. One thing that I've noticed and I really liked was their lightning quick connectivity. Other earbuds I've used in the past have always been quite slow, but these are just quick. They don't really advertise that or anything, it's just something I appreciated. On top of all of this, Raycons are surprisingly affordable. You really do get a lot of bang for your buck, and that's only going to get better with the deal Raycon is offering for my channel. You can go to buyraycon.com/TME today in order to get 20 to 50% off site-wide. You'll get up to 50% off everything on Raycon's website when you go to buyraycon.com/TME. Or you can save yourself some typing by clicking the link in the description below. If you're in the market for some new earbuds or maybe you just need an upgrade, I really couldn't recommend Raycons enough, so take advantage of this deal while it's out there. Stacy Ann Arras was 14 years old in July of 1981. The daughter of George and Carol Arras, she also had 3 siblings, Sandra, George, and Stephanie. At the time, Stacy and her family lived in Saratoga, California, just south of San Francisco. That July, Stacy and her father George had plans to go on a 4-day horseback riding trip through the High Sierra camps in Yosemite National Park. Outdoor adventures were not new to Stacy, as her mother would later tell reporters that she regularly would go on summer hikes every year. Besides this, it was reported that Stacy was having some problems at home and at school. There are no specific details about why this was occurring, but it's possible that the trip was meant to mend things between Stacy and her father. Still, that is entirely speculation. So Stacy and her father George made the roughly 175-mile trip to Yosemite. The first day of the horseback trip was July 17th, and the meetup location was Tuolumne Meadows in the eastern half of the park. There, George and Stacy met up with the rest of their group, which consisted of 10 people, though some sources say 20, and a lead wrangler by the name of Chris Grimes. The last picture of Stacy would be taken on this day, showing her atop a horse, ready to set out on their journey. She wears a timid smile, and her eyes are swallowed up by the shadow from her hat. Undoubtedly, nobody ever expected or anticipated the events that would follow. From the meadows, they set out on the John Muir Trail, which takes you up high into the granite-filled mountains. By 3 p.m., they had made it up to roughly 9,600 feet in elevation and stopped for lunch at the Upper Cathedral Lake, roughly 4.5 miles from where they started. After their brief respite, they continued on their journey for another 6 miles or so through a mountain pass until they came to their first destination, the Sunrise High Sierra Camp. The Sunrise High Sierra Camp consists of a number of tent cabins which provide visitors with more amenities than simply pitching your average tent on the ground. It's basically a cabin with canvas walls. This camp sits at roughly 9,300 feet in elevation. Once Stacy and her father arrived, they entered their cabin and unpacked. At some point, Stacy must have mentioned to her father that she was missing her boyfriend back in Saratoga. She then took a quick shower before telling her dad that she wanted to go and stretch her legs after spending the entire day sitting in a saddle. As she walked out of the cabin, George noticed that his daughter was wearing her flip-flops, so he told her to change into her hiking boots instead, which she did. When Stacy left the cabin, she was wearing shorts, a t-shirt, and a windbreaker. She also took a small Olympus camera which she was using to document her trip. In some way or another, she would end up going on this journey with a man named Gerald Stewart. Gerald was somewhere in his 70s, some sources say 70 and some say 77. All indications are that they really didn't know each other all that well, and likely met while on this trip. It's assumed that George was okay with his presence, but we really don't know that either. Moving on, Stacy wanted to get some good pictures of the nearby Sunrise Lakes, so she started asking people for directions. Eventually, Wrangler Chris Grimes set them on the correct path. So Stacy left the camp with her chaperone, Gerald, and the two began heading off towards the Sunrise Lakes. The hike to the lakes is a pretty easy 1.5 miles around a ridge with minimal elevation change. The duo had been hiking a short while, reportedly about 20 minutes, when Gerald became winded and needed to stop. Stacy told him that she was going to continue on towards the lakes and take her pictures. She then left on her own. Back at camp, Chris Grimes was tending to his horses in a corral when he looked towards the ridge. He reportedly saw Stacy standing on a rock and gazing into the distance. It is possible he was the last person to see her alive. Mr. Grimes went back to work in the corral, never imagining that anything would go wrong. Gerald Stewart, when he was done catching his breath, continued on down the trail towards the Sunrise Lakes, expecting to encounter Stacy at some point. Instead, he eventually ran into another group of 3 hikers. He asked them if they had passed Stacy on their way up. They said they hadn't. It was likely this point when Gerald realized something might be wrong. Of course, it must have also crossed his mind that Stacy left the trail at some point to go photograph one of the lakes, as you really have to leave the trail to get up close to the lakes or get a better vantage point on them. What actions Gerald took to find Stacy after running into the hikers is unknown, but he eventually made his way back to camp to report to Stacy's father that she was missing. Staff from the Sunrise High Sierra camp were the first to get out there and start searching. This makes sense as the situation was still developing. Stacy could have just decided to walk around one of the lakes, so they went out looking for her, but of course that was unsuccessful. Once they realized that Stacy was truly missing, they decided to get park rangers involved in the search. The official search began on July 18th, with many park personnel, professionals from nearby cities and counties, and volunteers. Well over 100 people were involved in the search on certain days. In one example, there were 80 people walking around on foot, 8 dog teams, and 3 helicopters. The National Guard brought in a 130-member Sierra Madre search and rescue team. The search focused on the area around the Sunrise Sierra Camp and the Sunrise Lakes. Searchers reportedly scoured a 5-mile area using grid patterns. The lakes in the area were searched by rangers in the event that Stacy fell in and drowned. Other teams used ropes to rappel down rock faces or climb up them. The entire area was described by some people as a war zone because of all the personnel and helicopters flying overhead. When it comes to the terrain, They told reporters that it is barren, except for the lakes, and strewn with giant granite boulders and pocked with steep ravines. Nighttime temperatures, even in the summer, were near freezing. Still, park rangers remained along the trail at night in case Stacy were to turn up. On July 20th, the use of helicopters was scaled back as search coordinators felt that most of the area that would be coverable by air had already been completed over the prior few days. From that point, ground searchers became the main focus. On July 22nd, almost a week into the search, operations in general began to be scaled back. Up to this point, nothing had been found at all. The Park Service's Linda Abbott called the situation unusual, saying, "We usually find some trace." She added that there are many nooks and crannies and ravines in that area, that it's impossible to look everywhere. If we haven't found any trace by dark, we'll be forced to reduce the search to just a few men looking on a casual basis. On July 26th, the search for Stacy Arras was officially called off. At this point, there was no reason to believe that Stacy could be lost and still alive. Park Ranger Tom Habecker stated, "It's just like she vanished. There are no tracks or no clues. It's a complete mystery." Some searchers tried to explain the outcome by saying that there were countless places where someone could slip and fall into a crevasse, or if she was injured, she could have crawled under a ledge or into a hollow. Besides that, canine handlers said that the lack of typical summer thunderstorms may have hampered the search dogs, as conditions throughout were always dry and dusty, and dogs were unable to pick up a scent. In total, over 8,000 man-hours were expended on the search for Stacy, and over 50 hours in helicopter time. The cost was somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. It was a huge search and effort, one of the largest in the history of the park. Stacy's mother, Carol, said of the search, "The tough part is not knowing. You would have thought that some trace of her would have shown up, perhaps her faded blue blouse, a windbreaker, at least something." Searchers felt much the same about the outcome, saying, "We didn't even find a gum wrapper," perhaps referencing the fact that Stacy was known to possibly be carrying chewing gum and also cigarettes. The 80s were a different time. With no clues being found in the search for Stacy, newspapers started to report some rumors of foul play. One was of an unkempt hiker being seen in the area where Stacy disappeared. Unfortunately, no information about him is known to the public. Other reports indicated that Stacy was having some family and school problems, and since she was missing her boyfriend, that maybe she had hiked out to the Tioga Pass Road and hitchhiked back to Saratoga. Or maybe she attempted to do that, but got a ride from a very bad person. Stacy's mother, Carol, seemed to shoot down this speculation, however, saying that Stacy had many friends, but no boyfriend, which she was missing that much. The park spokeswoman also had something to say regarding Stacy just walking off. She pointed to the fact that Stacy initially tried to leave her cabin wearing flip-flops. To her, that meant that Stacy certainly did not intend to go on a lengthy hike or attempt to run away. On another angle, investigators made a good effort to find possible witnesses. They checked anyone who had a wilderness permit, which backpackers are required to have in order to camp in the backcountry. They attempted to contact any people who would have been in the area when Stacy vanished. It's unknown if this attempt generated any leads, but one newspaper indicated that 500 were interviewed relating to the case. Other reports came in of Stacy being seen in Colorado, Nevada, and Oregon. None of these seem to lead to anything, and sightings are typical in any missing persons case, as there are plenty of people across the country who could have been mistaken as Stacy. One of the figures who is often talked about as a suspect is, of course, Gerald Stewart, a man in his 70s who accompanied Stacy on the first part of their hike. Since he was the one to be with Stacy last, it is pretty common for people to see that individual as a suspect. It probably doesn't help that we barely know anything about Gerald or how well he knew George or Stacy. When it comes to how they met, the most detail I've seen is a single newspaper that says, "She was last seen by a 77-year-old man who said he met her on a trail and accompanied her for 20 to 30 minutes before turning back towards the camp." That description makes it sound like she met Gerald on the trail to the lakes and started walking together. but this one newspaper could be absolutely incorrect on that because there are many errors in newspaper articles on this particular case. We do know that Gerald Stewart lived in Burlingame, just north of Saratoga, so he didn't live very far from Stacy and her family. All indications are that they didn't know each other, but again, there's very little out there to go by. The fact that he lives so close to the Arras family could have simply been a coincidence, or maybe a talking point that helped develop a friendship between George and Gerald while on the horseback trip. Or even Gerald and Stacy if they did just happen to meet while walking on the trail. In the end, it's hard to see Gerald as a suspect because he's a bit older, and even if he did do something, it's unlikely he could have moved a body very far, especially not in the time frame we're talking about here. It seems the Park Service never saw him as a suspect, but then again we can't be sure, and they obviously interviewed him, so they have far more details than we do to make an informed decision. Ultimately, that is where things stand as far as available information on the disappearance of Stacy Arras. We know very little, and that is likely because the Park Service has not really released any documents related to the case. I mean, they did release some documents at one point, but it was just a few pictures, newspaper clippings, and correspondence. It amounts to probably less than 1% of the total case file. Since this is one of those cases where we know very little, and also one of those cases that folks have asked me to cover so many times, I figured it would be necessary to head out to Yosemite and up to the Sunrise Lakes. Yosemite is an absolutely massive park at over 750,000 acres, or about 1,200 square miles, and perhaps most famous for its monolithic granite rock faces like El Cap and Half Dome. The park is so popular you can't just decide to drive in like most national parks. You have to make a reservation and then pay to get in. Even with the reservation system in place, the line to get into Yosemite can take a while. Once you're in, be prepared to spend a lot of time driving around if you want to see multiple locations. I spent 3 days at Yosemite, and during that time I felt like most of my time was spent driving from my campground to a trailhead, or from a trailhead to Yosemite Village. It pretty much took an hour to get anywhere because you're slowed down by the winding mountain roads all throughout the park. This isn't necessarily bad, it's simply a huge chunk of preserved nature. For this adventure, I did not plan on following the same path as Stacy Arras by starting over at the Tuolumne Meadows. Instead, I traveled to the trailhead at Tenaya Lake, where you can take the Sunrise Lakes Trail directly to the Sunrise Lakes. This made the most sense to me since getting to the lakes is the goal here. In addition to this, if Stacy did leave the lakes and make for a road, it is likely that she would have taken this trail as it is the fastest route out of the mountains. The trail starts at the lake, remains fairly level for a while before climbing a steep ridge. You then take a left at the fork and head towards the Sunrise Lakes. So let's get started on the trail. Good morning. I'm here in Yosemite on the trail heading to Sunrise Lakes. This is for the Stacy Arras case. Starting out at about a little over 8,000 feet, going up to over 9,000, I believe, maybe 9,300. So we'll see how I do with the altitude this time, though I have had a little time to acclimate, so hopefully it's not so bad. So far the trail's looking good, not too hot yet, and hopefully I'll make it to Sunrise Lakes in no time and get a look at the place and see how this enduring mystery could have occurred. So let's get a move on. Well, a little trail update. It's been a lot of up and down. It's getting a little warm outside. Still early morning though. Pretty rocky trail, beautiful, lots of trees. Like I said, lots of ups and downs so far. Nothing too steep though. Elevation, I can certainly feel it, but it's not as bad as say when I was doing Shasta. That's probably because I've been acclimated a little bit. I spent a lot of time in Flagstaff, Grand Canyon prior to coming here. Those are about 7,000 feet. So hopefully getting up to a little over 9 won't bother me too much, but as I've learned in the past, altitude and me do not agree, but we will see. So we're gonna continue on. Luckily this trail is pretty shady in a lot of spots, so that's great. Not a lot of direct sun. Looking forward to moving on. Well, I'm taking a brief respite. There's quite an altitude gain in one portion of this trail, pretty steep incline. So that's what I'm battling through right now. The view only gets better as you go up, but the hike gets pretty difficult at this point. I'm sure it'd be much easier coming down. right, so I've reached the top of the ridge, mountain, whatever you want to call it. And basically the max elevation I'm going to get to, about 9,200, 9,300. I've been checking my blood oxygen level, and it hasn't gone below 90 so far on this trip, which is great. Compared to some other higher altitude hikes I've had, where it's dipped into the 80s for quite some time. That's usually when I start getting sick. So things are going good. It seems to be pretty flat from here to the lakes. And boy, flat feels real good about now. And it's beautiful here. Once you crest the hill, you just get a nice view of surrounding valleys. Pretty good. I got to admit, when I was going up that ridge, boy, I was kind of wishing that I was on a horse. That would have made life so much easier. And it's quite apparent that they go up here because you see their excrement everywhere. So good on those horses. That's pretty steep. So moving along, next stop should be Sunrise Lakes themselves. Bigfoot tree break. Well, I made it to one of these Sunrise Lakes. The others are not far from here. Maybe we'll go check those out too. Feels good to finally make it here. It's an absolutely gorgeous lake. It came up and it was just like a mirror. And then when you get close enough, you can absolutely, it's just crystal clear. You can see the bottom, which kind of, it gives an answer, a bit of an answer to one of the questions I had about the search. So much is not known about how they did it and what they did. There's just occasional newspaper clippings. In reality, the National Park Service hasn't really released any of their own documentation on this search. They posted a little thing on their own website, but they provided basically nothing. They provided stuff like pictures, and not very many, and also some newspaper clippings that they just had in their records. None of their own generated records were actually released. So very little is known about what they did on the search. And when it comes to the lake, I was really curious about whether they searched that at all, if they did any dragging of the lake, because it is possible and maybe stands to reason that it could have perhaps been a drowning, or, you know, if you want to go the foul play route, maybe. I don't know. It's hard to say. Obviously, bodies float, but I don't know. It's one of those things I was wondering if they really checked into it all. I'll also take a moment and talk about Gerald, who's the older fella that went with Stacy as she was heading down to these lakes here. He was in his 70s. Some people see him as a suspect, which is fair. He was the last person to see her, and they were leaving together. He got tired, and she went on. There's a lot of questions around him, and again, because we don't have the report, we don't really have answers to those questions. But when it comes to Gerald and how they met him, how they knew him, a lot of questions arise around whether or not it makes sense that Stacy's father would just let his daughter go off with an older man who they don't know, or maybe they knew. We don't really know anything about him. My assumption is that he was also on their little horse ride that they were taking through the trails here. Maybe they got to know him, and during that time, we got to be real friendly with him. And I suppose the father got comfortable with the idea of sending his daughter off with Gerald to the Sunrise Lakes. Now, it makes sense that Gerald would have had to stop at some point, in my mind, because if you are taking a horse up here and going through all these trails, you're not really working your body, and so you might not notice the altitude as it's kicking in and hitting you. So once they get here and Gerald starts walking around and he has to come down here to the Sunrise Lakes, obviously it starts affecting him and he has to stop and sit down for a little while. That makes sense. Stacy, being a bit younger, was able to go on, and then she's just never seen again. So she was heading in this direction towards this lake, and something happened, and we don't know what. There is a trail obviously going through here. One of them heads back out to the road. It's about 3 miles back to the road, and it's pretty steep. Why would she do that? Doesn't really make any sense. Here is some footage of the terrain surrounding the first lake I came to. Obviously, this place is full of rock and boulders interspersed with trees. Still, it is pretty easy to move around in this area by the first lake. There are a few places one could hide, but I think an army of searchers would easily be able to cover this area with confidence. But in order to get a better feel of the area, I figured I might as well continue on to the next lake. Alright, I'm back on the trail again. I'm going to head to the next lake just to see what that one looks like, I guess. And I gotta say, I feel like this hike is going a lot better than some of the other ones I've done on this channel, because earlier this morning it was really looking like it was going to be a hot day. Sun was out. It's actually been pretty overcast. Totally moderately temperatured day. And I haven't been attacked by any bears or mountain lions. Go figure. So, things are going pretty well. So as we continue, I did want to briefly speak about the fact that it has been noted that Stacy was having some troubles at home, though they were unspecified what those were. I don't know if she was fighting with her father on the trip, or if there was just something going on in her life that we don't know about. Again, we lack information. and that while she was on this trip, she was also missing her boyfriend. I guess that was relevant because park officials needed to know if this was a disappearance that was done on purpose by the missing. Did Stacy leave of her own accord? We don't really know. It didn't seem like it. The main evidence for this is that she was leaving on this hike to the lakes here in her sandals, and her father stopped her and had her put on her hiking boots. And her dad said if she wanted to run away, it's unlikely she would have tried running away in her sandals. And that may be true. But then again, 14-year-old kids don't really think ahead like that. So, is it a good argument? Possibly. Then again, possibly not. I mean, if she wanted to hike down here in her sandals in the first place, obviously she wasn't very forward thinking about what it takes to actually hike on these trails. Probably because she'd been riding a horse for a lot of the time. So, I actually don't rule out voluntary disappearance on this one. It's just a possibility. I mean, she could have waited with Gerald, but she didn't. She kept going, and now she hasn't been seen again. And it's easy to get lost out here. Well, it's truly gorgeous out here. The lakes are just great. And one thing got me thinking is that a lot of this case kind of hinges on how far could Stacy walk. And again, that's kind of an unknown into itself. Because if she could get pretty far, then this search radius they had here would have been pretty intense. Most everything she had in terms of terrain, after leaving her camp, was downhill, which could be done pretty fast if you're in good shape. I'm not necessarily saying that she did run off, but it is a possibility. If the possibilities we're looking at are foul play or her running off, I feel like foul play is almost a harder sell. Because you're not going to get a body out of here. It would still need to be up here. So I'm here at the second lake of the Sunrise Lakes, and this one was a little different to get to. The first one had a clear trail heading to it. This one did not. Walked up on the main trail as far as I wanted to and almost past the lake here, and I couldn't see any trails anywhere. I also checked the GPS. There's nothing on the map that shows a trail leading here. Yet once you get to the lake, you start seeing some very small trailish looking things. So maybe there is a trail here, but if there is one, it's really not very obvious. So that's kind of interesting. Kind of clues you in that you could get lost trying to get here. Who knows? And if we want to talk about lost or getting lost instead of talking about foul play or voluntary disappearance, I think it is very possible that Stacy could have simply just got lost. One key point about this whole case is that she wanted to come down here and get photographs. And if there's one thing I kind of know about photographers, it's that they like to put themselves in dangerous places sometimes to get a really good picture. You know, there's some nice high points around here that you could try and climb to get really good pictures of these lakes. Makes me wonder if Stacy tried to do something like that, you know? I mean, she was a teenager. She may not have been safety conscious, as many of us teenagers, when we were that age, we weren't either. So it's a possibility. So, and if that occurred, who knows? She could have fallen. There's so much granite around here, it would be really hard to search this area. You'd be climbing all over the place. So was it just a teenager who wasn't feeling very safety conscious and started climbing into areas she shouldn't have been, and then was trying to get some pictures of these lakes on her own, left her little chaperone behind in Gerald? Hard to say, but it is a viable theory in my opinion that she could have simply got lost or had an accident while doing something like that. So something to think about. Some newspapers mention Stacy taking a trail that goes up a ridge in order to take pictures, but that is not a description of the trail leading to the Sunrise Lakes. And while I always take newspaper articles with a grain of salt, I do wonder if something like that did occur. Hiking up a ridge to get a photo and then falling into a crack in the granite could be an explanation for what happened. Though I'd still be a bit surprised that she wasn't found given the intensity of the search efforts in this area. We know that when Stacy initially disappeared, some of the staff from the camp up above came down and looked for her, but to be honest with you, depending on how many there were, this is actually a really huge area to have to look. I mean, 3 lakes, and they're separated from each other, and there's a ton of granite everywhere that is climbable. That's a lot to have to look at. Obviously, they didn't find her, and so they had to call in more help. Much of the search is kind of a mystery though, and that's the thing I don't like about this case. It bothers me to do cases where we don't have all the information, and why the NPS is holding that, I am not so sure. Though, in my experience, when the NPS has a huge case file, which purportedly they have a rather large one on this case that they don't want to release, it reminds me of the Dennis Martin case. You know, Dennis Martin disappeared in the 60s, so it was before Stacy disappeared. They eventually released those records, and what was in those? Supposed evidence of possible foul play, but pretty much unlikely. I mean, nothing was definitive. It makes me wonder if it's something similar with this. Now, obviously, Stacy disappeared later, and we are over 40 years on from this case, so maybe it's about time they release it, because whether there was foul play or not, it's going to be a little too late to charge anyone. I mean, if there was some sort of murderer involved in this case, he would have to be at least 60, if not older by now. And something tells me they're not really actively investigating this anymore. So I feel like they should release it, but every park is kind of its own thing, you know. Great Smoky Mountains released the Dennis Martin case file. That was their choice. You know, they decided, we're done investigating this, the public can have it. Apparently, Yosemite likes to really hold on to their cases and say, no, 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 we're still investigating it, so the public can't see it, even though it's almost certain they are not investigating it. You can look on that with suspicion. I just look on it as, you know, some parks don't function well. They have a bunch of people that are just power hungry. They don't like to release records or what. Who knows what their reason is. I wouldn't be surprised if the day comes when they do release these records and there's something odd in there, maybe a suspect or something. But obviously, it is really unlikely anything is going to come of that. But it's hard to compile a record of possibly thousands of pages about someone who disappeared in a remote area. I mean, what are all those pages of? Narrative reports of the search, that's not going to take up that much. Interviews with witnesses, apparently there were only really 2. But of course they would have interviewed her family and any other people in the area that they found. And apparently they were checking any register they could to find people in this area. So maybe they did do a lot of interviews. Maybe that is a bulk of it. But I don't know, what else, you know? There's apparently no evidence, no clues in this case, so, but that's just what was reported in the papers. Maybe there is clues. But then again, Yosemite is a funky park when it comes to releasing records. Others are more amiable and they will allow it, but Yosemite is just weird. So that's kind of the deal with the information related to this case and why we have so little of it. So it's actually pretty secluded out here too, by the way. I've seen very few people at the lakes. I saw quite a few people coming up the trail to get up here, but I think they were actually taking a separate trail and going a different direction. The lakes are really secluded and quiet, and I suppose you could say in a way eerie, just because, you know, Stacy disappeared up here, and I'm aware of that fact and aware that it's always a possibility that her remains could still be up here. And so that's pretty typical for anywhere I go, and that's a secluded area where the missing individual hasn't been found. But it's such a serene place. It's just it's weird to think about the tragedy that has occurred here as well. I suppose it's also worth talking a little bit about foul play while we're here. I think this is going to be the last lake I stop at. But one thing I've noticed just walking through the wilderness out here is there are the occasional campfires you run into, evidence that someone was kind of wilderness camping in this area. I'm sure the same was true back in the 80s, though I'm sure things have changed a lot. I mean, Yosemite itself has changed a lot with the amount of people that they let in and things like that. And you got to get a permit to camp out here overnight. But the question is, how many people were camping here when Stacy disappeared? And is it possible one of them was somehow involved in her disappearance? Abduction, I think, is out of the question, because abducting people at high altitude and trying to get a 14-year-old girl down off of this mountain would be extremely difficult. To kill someone, on the other hand, and hide the body, that might be a different situation altogether. Is it worth contemplating? Maybe. I mean, anything's a possibility when we don't know anything, so. But that doesn't mean much, you know. Could Bigfoot be involved? Sure, why not? But foul play, what are the odds that someone was up here and were evil enough to want to do harm to a 14-year-old girl? Sure, it's possible. Hopefully it didn't happen. I am tending to lean more to lost, or she went off trail to take that picture and fell, because some of these slopes are real steep, or
Did she try and leave? What was her relationship like with her father on this trip? Why didn't her father go with her? Why was it Gerald, this kind of unknown man that they might have just met and had only known for a few days while riding horses? A lot of unanswered questions in that sense. I feel like a broken record, but I really wish we knew more because it would really help develop a theory in this case. But at the top of the list, I'd have to say she went off trail looking for a picture, fell, died somewhere difficult to get to, and then that possibility that she just decided to get out of here somehow. Maybe she knew it was only probably four miles to the nearest road, but was she the kind of child to run away? A lot of unknowns about her personality, which makes it hard to really speculate. You might be looking at that hillside I just showed and thinking that it seems a little far-fetched that she would try to go up there to take a picture of this lake. And that's not really what I'm saying. I think that would be really difficult and she probably wouldn't attempt it. But the camp is actually up there behind me. So she would have been up there coming down towards where I am. And could she have tried to go out onto a ledge there and get a picture of this lake that I'm at? Absolutely. And it wouldn't require walking up as much. So that's more what I'm talking about when I talk about did she try to get a good vantage point for a picture, because when you're up higher and you're coming down, there's more options for you to get or go to ledges where you could get a good vantage point and possibly have an accident. Unfortunately, I don't know exact coordinates or anything about where she was last seen, but obviously she was on the move, so the possibilities are endless, anywhere from the first lake on down to the third, so a lot of unknowns. A lot of people talk about Yosemite and are kind of scared of it, it seems like, because so many people go missing here. But in a way, it kind of makes sense. Yosemite is a gigantic park, and it is one of the more wild parks out there. The fact is, there are actually very few roads going through Yosemite. There is roads going along up and down, north to south on the western edge of Yosemite, and then there's one that goes from west to east. So when you look at a map of it, that's actually not a lot. Most of this terrain is all you got to get to it through hiking. I think Yosemite is largely about hiking. This is a place you come to recreate, move around, hike, do whatever. Sure, there's some sightseeing you can do. You can come in here and see Half Dome and El Cap and all the other big granite faces that Yosemite is known for. But to really get the Yosemite experience, you really have to hike here. And a lot of people come and do that and they're not prepared. And I think that's what leads to so many disappearances around here. So, I mean, other parks, they're very different. Sometimes they're much more about access and seeing certain things. Take Yellowstone, for example. You got, Old Faithful, the Grand Prismatic Spring, plenty of other geysers and springs in the area. And all of them have well-maintained trails or, wooden bridges that lead right to where you need to go to see what you want to see. And roads going through Yellowstone, there's a big circular one, as I recall, and you can pretty much go around the whole thing and see the sights. It's a little more involved here at Yosemite, so I do wonder if that's the reason why more people disappear here and very few disappear at Yellowstone. Just kind of walking around the area, I'll say that surrounding the second lake, there is a lot of boulder fields. Now, I don't necessarily think that's relevant to anything, but I figure some people out there might be interested in that fact. And let me be quite clear that while I am kind of going off trail in this general area, and of course I got a GPS, personal locator beacon and all that, but what I'm trying to say is that I have no illusions that I'm going to find anything relevant at this point. Again, it's been over 40 years, I believe, since this occurred. It's been a long time, and the chances of finding anything at this point are pretty slim. Possibly some bones left somewhere, maybe some gear, that camera. But you'd hope that they searched this place quite thoroughly. But again, we don't really know. You can only hope. But it's kind of interesting taking a look around. Some areas are easier to navigate than others. Some areas are steeper and you have to climb over a lot of granite. That sure does look like a trail, so maybe there is a trail here, but it's hard to see from the main path. It's kind of hard to tell because some of these granite slabs you get confused into thinking they're like a sidewalk or something, you know, it just tricks the eye, and then you realize, no, that's just a granite slab. No one poured any concrete or anything, and you realize what looked like a path is just some slab granite that's sitting here. So it can be kind of interesting. You can be led astray. Well, I gotta say that despite knowing what has occurred up here and that there is a still missing individual in this area, I really wish I could have got a wilderness permit to camp out here at this lake, because it's really peaceful here and just gorgeous, and I could avoid hiking back today. But the permits for this area go real fast and are hard to get, so that's just how it goes sometimes. And you know, to get into pretty much anything you want to do at Yosemite, you're going to have to think way in advance and get the proper permits. And just goes to show how popular this place is. They let a limited number of people in. Every summer now, you got to get a reservation just to get in, and the lines are still long. And if you want to do things or camp overnight in the wilderness, you got to get a permit for that. And if you want to climb Half Dome, you got to get a permit for that. And so many people have wanted to come here that pretty much anything you want to do, you're going to have to pay for and plan ahead of time and get the proper permits for. And it's a little bit more of a pain than other parks, but that's just kind of how it goes for places of beauty, I guess. Everyone wants to go there. And yet, surprisingly, like I said, I really haven't seen anyone here, so go figure. I wonder who those permits went to. If you're watching this, I hope you enjoyed it. So, but that's kind of how it goes, and I'm going to have to head out of here pretty soon. I haven't had any additional thoughts looking around the terrain here, and other than it's actually a really nice place, and I think anyone would be lucky to come here and camp out. Well, I'm heading back down now. It's getting a bit hot out. The sun finally showing its face, and luckily I just got a lot of downhill to do because I'm pretty tired of going up. One thing I noticed just heading back down again and just looking around is that if you get off trail here in many of these areas, say if you wanted to go take a picture and you went off trail, and then you tried to look back down where you had just been, you would not be able to see where the trail was. I mean, it just looks like everything else. When you're on the trail, it's more easy to see where you need to go because this whole area is just large chunks of granite everywhere. And you have a general direction of where you need to go. Obviously, I have the benefit of a GPS, so I always know where to go, but if you left the trail and then tried to come back, you could have a hard time finding the trail again. Just another in the long line of possibilities of what could have happened to Stacy out here. And I do think the probability is that she left to take a picture of something, try to get a better vantage point, and she either lost the trail or had an accident. That's what's making the most sense to me right now, looking at this place and just looking at all the places you could go to try and get a photo of these gorgeous lakes. You could head up that way. Looks doable. I'm sure it'd be kind of tough, but you'd get a hell of a picture. Finding your way back to the trail might be a different thing. Or making sure you don't fall because we're at 9,300 feet here. That's another thing too. So just another possibility. One thing I keep noticing as I'm walking down is how many areas you can go off trail that kind of look kind of fun, to be honest with you. If you like climbing on rocks, then Yosemite is the place to be for sure. There's all sorts of all sorts of boulders everywhere that look like it'd be fun to get up on, to get a good vantage point, go off trail. You know, I was just looking out over there and I was like, oh, that might be an interesting place to go check out. Obviously, I'm not doing that on this trip, but trying to get in the headspace of other people or even a teenager, you know, who might want to go explore an area that looks like it would be fun to explore. Just something I was thinking about.
There is an undeniable beauty in the Yosemite wilderness. While walking the trails, you encounter many areas that are seemingly begging you to go off trail, to see what's around the next bend or over the next ridge. It's pretty human to want to explore, but Yosemite is a vast and rugged place. Perhaps that is part of the reason why so many people go missing in this particular park. The hike down from the Sunrise Lakes is easier in just about every way, except maybe on the knees. Could a 14-year-old girl do this? Yes, of course. But would she want to? That is really the question, and it is one that we can't be certain of given the information we have. You would hope or think that somebody would have seen Stacy on the Sunrise Lakes Trail if she decided to walk out that way. It would have taken her quite some time to do so. Then again, she would have made the hike in the evening when there would be fewer people on the trail. Before we continue on, there is one aspect of this case that I think is important to cover. In some ways, the Stacy Arras case is relatively unremarkable in this category of missing people. And what I mean by that is the fact that it's a case where someone seemingly vanishes without a trace, and we know few details about it because the records haven't been released. There are quite a few cases like that, and most of them are not nearly as well known. So the Arras case has certainly grown in terms of recognition in the last 10 to 15 years, and I think there is really only one reason for that: Missing 411 and David Paulides. He brought attention to this case with his retellings on radio programs, in his books, and of his attempts to get the Stacy Arras case file. If you're not familiar with that story, let's take a minute to cover it. When compiling his first two books, Paulides was researching Stacy's case and attempted to get the case file from Yosemite. His request was denied, but more than that, he received a phone call from an NPS special agent. The man wanted to know why Paulides wanted this old case file, which the reason shouldn't matter. They shouldn't even ask. In the end, the agent told Paulides that he would never get the case file for Stacy Arras. He told Paulides that there were no suspects in the case and that it was still considered a missing person incident, and not necessarily a crime. Still, the exemption used to prevent the records release was one which states that releasing the records could interfere with future law enforcement proceedings. Usually, this is one you see used when they actually believe there to be a crime or even a suspect. But it's also one they can use if a body has never been found and they just want to jam you up. Afterwards, Paulides attempted to file an appeal where a separate authority reviews the decision to see if it was made correctly. That appeal is on record, so let's take a quick look at it. Right up front, the NPS tells him that his appeal was denied and that they properly invoked Exemption 7A, which permits withholding records that could reasonably be expected to interfere with law enforcement proceedings. They also advise him that the NPS has a criminal investigation into the incident that is still ongoing. That statement alone seemingly goes against what the special agent supposedly told Paulides on the phone. The NPS then goes on to explain how premature release of the records could affect their investigation by providing a virtual roadmap through the government's evidence, prematurely revealing the full scope of the evidence obtained, hinder the NPS's ability to further control and shape the investigation, and create a great potential for witness intimidation. This is essentially the same reasoning the FBI used to withhold the Dennis Martin records for so many years. But as we know, they released them not that long ago, and probably because like 50 years had passed and everyone was dead. Once the suspects and witnesses are all dead, there's really nothing more to protect. The Dennis Martin case was older than Stacy's, but I would guess that Stacy's case file could be released within 10 years' time. I mean, most of the people involved in Stacy's case are probably dead already. Anyway, going back to the Paulides appeal, he actually tried a clever little attempt at circumventing the exemption by arguing that the NPS allowed former law enforcement ranger Charles Farabee to view the case file for writing his book, Off the Wall: Death in Yosemite. You see, if the NPS had previously released the case file to someone, and that information made it into the public, the NPS can no longer hide behind exemptions for others seeking the same records at a later date. Basically, once you release records to one person, you can't withhold them from another at a later date. Though Politis doesn't explain how he knows that Farabee did have access to the case file in the first place, and that turns out to be kind of a problem. Still, Politis argued that Farabee wrote a lengthy section in his book about the disappearance of Stacy Arras, and that due to this, the NPS waived its right to invoke an exemption. Unfortunately, the NPS did their due diligence and looked at the book that Politis referenced. They said that the Stacy Arras segment in Farabee's book is not lengthy, as Politis described, and they're really not wrong about that. It's basically one page out of a 600-page book. And while it does have basic details that weren't in newspapers, it does nothing but provide a basic overview of the Stacy Arras disappearance. So while Politis' argument was clever, it really had no standing when you go and read the book. The NPS states that the short, general discussion in Mr. Farabee's book regarding Miss Arras's disappearance does not reflect the detailed information contained in the nearly 2,000 pages that comprise the case file that you seek. In light of this, there is no basis for the department to conclude that any record in the public domain duplicates that being withheld by the NPS in this case. Thus, you have not met your burden of establishing that a waiver occurred. The NPS goes on to state that they did not allow Farabee to review the case file for writing his book, and that they contacted Farabee personally about this, and he said that the few paragraphs in his book regarding the incident derived from his personal knowledge he gained about the incident when he participated in the search activities, which kind of makes David Politis look a bit bad. Either way, that was their full reason for denying the release of these records, but really the appeal alone gives us some important information to take note of. We learned that they are treating the case as a criminal investigation, and that there are about 2,000 pages worth of documents in the case file. That is a massive case file for an incident like this. And this is where Stacy's case differs from other unsolved disappearances with few details. On those cases where someone vanishes without a trace, and the search fails, and there's no suspects or witnesses, there's very little writing. I've obtained access to so many cases like that, cases of true vanishings, where you get the case file and it's somewhere between 2 and 10 pages. And information contained in them basically says, John Doe disappeared, we looked for him, but we didn't find him. The case remains open. I've got quite a few cases like that, but I can't even make a video on them because there's so little to talk about. In this case, in Stacy's case, there is somewhere around 2,000 pages. That shows there was a serious investigation here. You don't generate that much paper when the situation is just a girl disappeared, we looked for her, we didn't find her. And I'm sure someone's going to bring up the 500 people that the NPS interviewed in relation to this case, but I bet that makes up a very small portion of the total case file because 99% of those interviews probably went like this. Did you see a blonde-haired girl while hiking in Yosemite? No, I didn't. So, while it outwardly seems like very little is known about this case, it would appear that this is not the truth. Obviously, there is much more to know because the case file is so big. I just can't imagine you would have that many pages and no leads. So, even though I can see certain ways that someone like Stacy could fall and die in the area of the Sunrise Lakes, you really can't rule out some kind of foul play. And that is simply based on the fact that the NPS is holding a ton of information that we are not privy to. I mean, I could see a scenario where Stacy attempted to hike to the Tioga Pass Road and started hitching rides back to Saratoga. We know very little about what her mindset was while she was on this trip, other than that she was having trouble at home and at school and that she missed her boyfriend. We don't even have a statement from her father describing her behavior leading up to the disappearance. We are lacking so much. And while I understand the park spokeswoman's statement that since Stacy initially tried leaving her cabin wearing only flip-flops, it would be indicative of her not attempting a very long hike, that is a fair argument. However, another part of me also considers that teenagers don't always think things through. Still, I can find plenty of flaws with this theory as well. I have questions about whether or not she knew that the trail to the Sunrise Lakes was also the quickest way to the road. Who told her that? She probably could have managed that trail fairly quickly if she knew about it. She did ask for directions from multiple people in the camp, so it is possible she could have got this information from them. Lastly, the 3 hikers coming up the trail and meeting Gerald said that they didn't see Stacy at all. That's obviously a problem. I suppose it's possible she could have avoided them if she was moving around the lakes and off trail, though. And like many disappearances, you have to come up with a detailed scenario that allows a theory to fit with the known details and circumstances. While I do think the simplest explanation is that Stacy climbed up a ridge to get a picture and then slipped and fell, it's hard for me to imagine how that simple of an explanation could account for almost 2,000 pages of a case file that exists. When it comes to this case, the Park Service has shown many signals that seem to indicate they have something in terms of foul play, from the special agent who talked to Politis to the appeal stating it's a criminal investigation to the size of the case file. It's not something I'm used to seeing when the Park Service believes a case is simply a lost person. I have received numerous case files from the Park Service that relate to missing persons cases that are still open. They released them because none of the evidence pointed to foul play. They aren't doing that in this case. We won't truly know what the Park Service has or doesn't have until they finally release their documents. That could be a while. Still, I think there's enough here to make some inferences about what could have happened to Stacy. I know this is a case that often gets the paranormal treatment, mostly due to it being a popular missing 411 case, but I really don't see any need to bring the paranormal into this one. There are plenty of earthly explanations that could be had here, despite the fact that we know very few details about the investigation. Anyway, let me know your theories that you have about this case in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching.